Sacraments 101 is a series which seeks to highlight the 7 sacraments of the Roman Catholic Church and to give its listeners a better understanding of the outward signs instituted by Christ to give his people grace. Your program host is Father Jim Corda.
Hello and welcome to this edition of Sacraments 101. I'm Father Jim Corda. Joining me is Father Chris Cicero, and we're going to talk again about the sacrament of matrimony. Welcome to our show.
Thank you, Father.
You know, in the last time we were together, we talked about some of the scriptural references that dealt with the sacrament of marriage. I think what we'd like to do now is talk more about the history of the development of the sacrament as we know it today.
Sure. With history of marriage, the first thing is that marriage is something that predates the church. You know, if we look at, as Christians, the text that we go to understand who we are, we look at the book of Genesis, that marriage has always been, that there's this phenomenon of marriage across the lines of culture and religion or lack of religion, whatever it may be, that this institution of marriage has a history that goes back as far as we can see. So the first thing is that we don't approach marriage as the invention really of anyone, of the church, of society, but rather that God is the author of marriage. It's part of the phenomenon that we receive as human persons, that there always has been marriage. Now, in the history of salvation, marriage has kind of gone through a process. We have the example of original marriage. Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, God's plan for them was happiness, providence, communion of persons, peace, well-being, the command to live off of the land, to be fruitful and multiply, and everything was good. Everything was good with the beginning of humanity, the beginning of the human family, marriage, and then sadly, what has happened is sin entered the world. Right from the beginning, Adam and Eve in the garden. The scripture is explaining to us this additional phenomenon of sin, that Adam and Eve disobeyed God. They did something selfish. They grasped for power. They grasped for authority that wasn't theirs. They turned against the Lord, and consequently they turned against one another. They became ashamed of who they were, and Adam and Eve in the garden start to fear one another. At the beginning, Adam and Eve were nude in the garden, fearless of being used or abused by one another, kind of sort of a freedom and an openness towards one another. After sin, in the account of Genesis, we see that they cover themselves, kind of to protect each other from lust, which is what entered the world through sin. Lust is basically pretty much any use of another person for one's own gain. We associate it mostly with sexual sins, but lust can be any kind, really, abuse of another person for one's own gain. After lust entered into the world, marriage became much more difficult. As the scripture says, as the catechism affirms, a lot of the gifts in the garden became burdens. They experienced the toil of working the earth. They experienced the pain of childbirth. These things that were gifts became burdensome because of the fall from grace. Throughout the history of Israel, marriage had a role, and there were laws written about marriage. There were laws written about divorce. And it isn't that marriage just ceased to be anything useful. It didn't. In the Old Testament, marriage, there was a spiritual component of marriage that was very strong. That marriage was a help somewhat of a remedy to this experience of sin, that the married couple could help each other in light of this inclination to use one another, that their matrimonial covenant would be a remedy against that. And then a significant development with Christ, dealing with now the history of salvation, the era of salvation in which we live since the incarnation of Jesus. Jesus dealt with marriage. He was asked very directly about his thoughts on marriage and divorce by the Pharisees, Gospel of Matthew. He's asked, Jesus, what do you say about divorce? Moses said, we can have divorce. What do you say? And it's very interesting how Jesus answers that question. He doesn't just say yes or no, or based on my authority as the Son of God, I think you should do this. He gives kind of an organic answer by appealing to what God said from the beginning. Okay, going back to the starting point, Jesus says, in the beginning, God created marriage, and the two become one flesh. And Moses permitted divorce because of the hardness of your hearts. But Jesus is saying we have to look at what was God's original plan, which is for lifelong fidelity in the spousal covenant.
Now let's talk specifically about sacramental marriage and Christian marriage. What constitutes that? Is every marriage celebrated in the Catholic Church sacramental? Are most marriages Christian marriages? What's the definition?
First thing is that the Church does not claim that it has a monopoly on marriage, valid marriage. It does not claim that. We recognize the marriages of, let's say, two non-Catholic Christians. Okay, we recognize the marriages of Muslims, of mixed religions, of people who don't believe at all. We recognize those as valid marriages. In the Church, there are kind of stipulations, for lack of a better word, of who can be married. Okay, you can have in the Church a marriage between two Catholics, a Catholic and a Protestant, a Catholic and a non-believer, a Catholic and a Jew, a Catholic and a Muslim, or someone of an Eastern religion. You can have these mixed marriages in the Church. What the Church teaches is that sacramental marriage is between two baptized Christians. That the marriage of two baptized Christians is sacramental. The marriage between a Catholic and a Muslim is a valid marriage. Okay, it's recognized. It can happen in the Church. But in terms of being a sacrament, what is required is the faith of the two spouses, that both profess faith in Jesus, which is essentially expressed in the baptism sacrament.
We probably would want to also clarify that it doesn't make it any less meaningful because it is blessed by the Church and recognized and supported and encouraged, but yet that sacramental quality is distinctive when we're talking about that. There's a word, kind of a big word, that oftentimes is used in marriage, and that's indissolubility. What exactly does that mean, and why do we use that word in the Catholic Church?
Right. In the last episode, we talked about how really in the marriage rite, the only condition expressed, the only way out expressed in the rite is death, and the natural death of one spouse is what brings to an end a marriage covenant. Indissolubility is basically saying that we hold marriage to be lifelong, and that the marriage vows, if valid, cannot be dissolved. Okay, they cannot be extracted. It's interesting because in civil marriage, the state will say, we can declare you no longer married. Okay? The Church says we cannot do that based on the teaching of Jesus in the gospel The passage I referred to earlier from the Gospel of Matthew, the church says we cannot just declare you, Jack and Jill, are no longer married, okay, because Jesus affirmed the doctrine about marriage as it was in the beginning, seen in the beginning in the book of Genesis, as a lifelong unto death partnership.
We've only got about 2 minutes left of our first segment, so we want to be brief on this one. How do we see marriage and matrimony, the sacrament, as a vocation? You know, oftentimes when we think of vocations, we think of priesthood and religious life or diaconate, but yet marriage is truly a vocation. Why is that, and how important is that for them to recognize?
Sure. You know, marriage, definitely a vocation, a calling. I think what's helpful to couples, to help them to assess where they are with that calling, is to think about their identity. A single person thinking about his or her identity will talk about family of origin, things I like to do, goals in life. So I could, you know, as a single person, you could talk all about these qualities of myself. When you're called to the vocation of married life, someone's self-identification necessarily now has to include another person. Not just what I like, what I want to do, what my goals are, but when I think of who I am, you know, Jack, the groom, thinks about who I am, in order to adequately and fully answer that question, he has to talk about Jill. I can only be truly myself, the person God created me to be, if Jill's in my life, and I always make a place for her, and I lay down my life for her. You're right. I think it is more clearly seen with priestly vocations, with religious vocations. Married life is in no way a lesser calling, less of a vocation. You know, it is a vocation in the church, one that really needs to be discerned. You know, can I accept that identity, that I am no longer just me, but who I am is we. Who I am includes another person.
Just very briefly, marriage, like any kind of vocation, really takes work and energy and perseverance. You think even more so in marriage, or in a similar way with any vocation?
Has to be similar, I suppose. I don't think any vocation is easy. I've had some parishioners who have lived multiple vocations in their lifetime, multiple vocations in the church married life. And the testimony to me is that they're all hard. There isn't one that was easier. As a priest, I look at people who are married and I see a whole set of challenges that I don't have. I also see challenges in my life that maybe they don't have. But the last thing I think, as I view another's vocation, religious life or married life, two callings that I don't have, the last thing I would think is that that's where the grass is greener. I don't see that at all.
We're going to take a quick break. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
What have you done for your marriage today?
I gave my wife a hug this morning. I told her I love her.
I did her hair this morning. I think it looks pretty good.
I cooked my husband's favorite breakfast.
I bought her an orchid.
What have I done for my marriage today? I sent my husband a love email.
I read the newspaper to my wife, and it cracked her up. But she's still laughing.
What have you done for your marriage today? Make a change for the better. Need help? Go to foryourmarriage.org, a message from the Catholic Church.
Welcome back to our show. I'm talking with Father Chris Cicero on the Sacrament of Marriage. You know, probably, Father Chris, what we need to do also is to talk about divorce and annulments. Those are two things that are part of the human condition. We don't want to really muddle the waters when we're talking about the sacrament of marriage, but it's probably important to at least address those. So what is the Church saying in regards to divorce?
Sure. You're absolutely right that divorce is a reality. We have parishioners who are people of deep faith who are divorced. Many of them had never hoped to be divorced in their lifetime, but it's the reality. This has happened for whatever reason. There are lots of misunderstandings about the Catholic Church and our understanding of our teachings on divorce. As I said before, the Church does not grant divorces, okay? But the Church does not turn its back on divorced people, okay? I have many divorced people in my parish who are good people and make a wonderful contribution to our community. So the Church treats divorced people with compassion. It's a painful part of people's life. The Church accompanies those people. The Holy Fathers uses the word accompaniment frequently and beautifully. We accompany divorced people who are in pain. Sometimes we discover that a divorce happened because there was a problem in a marriage relationship from the beginning. Okay, basically, a divorce says this marriage no longer exists. The Church does not say that. The Church can assess that a marriage was invalid from the beginning, however, that these two people entered into this marriage. There were invalidating circumstances. The Church can declare that it was invalid from the beginning, and basically that provides freedom to marry for those divorced people. But the Church never says, we declare you are no longer married. Okay, the Church may declare that it can be proven that from the beginning there was an invalidating factor or factors in a marriage.
And we do know that in the life and also history of the Church that those who have been divorced and wish to enter into another marriage in the Church go through the annulment process. Let's briefly just mention that and what might be involved and what they should do if they're interested in that.
Sure. There are many different forms of annulment in the Church. And by that I mean it's basically different means to the same end, more or less, different ways that it can be proven that a marriage was invalid. The one that probably gets the most attention we refer to as the formal annulment process. Sometimes it's called like the long form, in which one of the former spouses will, basically make a case for why they think there was some invalidating circumstance in the marriage from the beginning, and the Church makes a judgment on that. There's a tribunal, judges who look at a case and can declare whether or not there is sufficient evidence and therefore proof for invalidity from the beginning. I'm not a canon lawyer, but on the parish level, I work with folks going through those cases. I know that there are people in parishes who have gone through the annulment process and have found it very freeing and healing. Whether they get remarried or not. Some may be really, I got my annulment, I found this other person, we're entering into this marriage, we're much more mature, we're much more spiritually in tune, and that whole process is very, very healing. Other people who don't intend to get married or don't know, but get the annulment because they truly believe that something was not right there from the beginning, and they would like that freedom from what was.
And those who might be in that situation should contact their parish or the diocese or their priest in order to get more of a formal understanding of what's involved in that. Let's now kind of end our time together with the new rite of matrimony. We know that over the course of the Church that the sacraments have been kind of, for lack of a better word, updated or renewed. And so the new rite of marriage is one of those that we're experiencing most recently. What are some of those changes if we can use that word, that have occurred that makes it new, a new rite, R-I-T-E?
Right. The new rite is basically being activated in Advent of 2016. And some of the additions to the rite, there is somewhat of an expansion of offerings in terms of readings. Mm-hmm. There's a clarification in terms of rubrics. That the rubrics, which is the part of the ritual book that kind of tells us what to do, how to do it. Some clarification there for what's permitted in the church in the United States. Also a retranslation of texts. Mm-hmm. So since 2011, we've been experiencing that with the third edition of the Roman Missal, which was a new translation of the Latin edition of the Missal. Basically what they've done here is taken the Latin edition, which I believe is from around 1990, right. Early 1990s, retranslated it according to the norms set forth by the Vatican, and we have a new rite. I don't. Maybe one thing that in a lot of parishes will be more noticeable is the Gloria, right. Even though it says for certain in the Roman Missal from 2011, the provision is there in the wedding mass for the Gloria. I think that now that there will be consistency in the rite of marriage book, that we'll be hearing the Gloria sung during the Mass. And I think even in the penitential seasons, it will be permitted to say or sing the Gloria during the Mass. It also has some provisions for some cultural things that are done during weddings, the lasso in some cultures, and some forms of the expression of consent, the vows, that have some historical development that are now officially in the rite. By and large, I don't think that people are going to experience this radical change in the rite of marriage. Those of us who do marriages on a regular basis are going to see that more clearly. But I think for most folks who are getting married, attending weddings, won't be a real radical change.
Let's talk about, in our last 5 minutes of our time together, about the role of the priest in marriage, or the deacon in some occasions. Why is that role important and imperative for the proper form of marriage, and what especially can the priest do, even though the priest has no real qualities because they have not been married, and yet there are some things that we do bring to married couples or engaged couples. What is the role, and why is that important?
Sure. I think that the priest or deacon is the church witness. They are representing the church in the role in the sacrament. As I said, the ministers of the sacrament are the husband and the wife, okay? Not the priest, not the deacon. But the priest or deacon who is required to be there is the church's witness, showing that the church has something to do with this sacrament, blesses, approves the relationship. The church is praying for these people. We're celebrating. If you have a wedding mass, the church is offering the Eucharist and thanksgiving for the couple. Also, it calls to mind the role, especially of the priest. That by virtue of his ordination, the priest represents Christ. Especially in the liturgy. The priest has a special role in the liturgy as a representative of the head of the body, the one that stands in the place of Christ, who acts in persona Christi capitis. And during the rite of marriage, the priest stands there as another symbol of the role of Jesus in the sacrament. How does that relate to more than pictures and someone who signs as the church witness on a form in your file? We believe that for marriage to be truly full and successful as a sacrament, the grace of Jesus is needed. The priest during the wedding represents that tangibly. Going away from the altar, the couple needs the spiritual assistance of Jesus Christ, the grace of Jesus through the sacrament of marriage, which we believe is provided through the sacrament of holy matrimony.
You know, oftentimes, I know in my many years of priesthood and your years of priesthood, we come in contact with lots of engaged couples. And at least my experience, they're not all the same. They're sometimes vastly different. They come with different backgrounds, emotionally, spiritually, educationally. They come sometimes prepared and sometimes not prepared. And so it's really the priest's role to engage them into understanding the importance of the sacrament. And there's different tools that we have come to use in getting to know a couple. And sometimes we don't always have that opportunity as the priest to really get to know the couple like we'd like to or like we sometimes need to. But yet it's important to be very pastoral with engaged couples, because that impression that we give hopefully will carry them through many years until death do them part. So how important is that pastoral approach and personal touch in the sacrament?
Yeah, in the course of someone's lifetime, they probably won't spend more time directly with a priest than they do in marriage prep, for layman and woman. So however many meetings that is, if it's 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 meetings, one-on-one with a priest, you probably won't get that much contact again ever in your life. It's extremely important for us as priests to take that seriously, especially as an opportunity for evangelization. One of the things that we find is that most of the couples coming forward are not practicing their faith. Okay, it's not that they're non-believers. It's not that they have something against the church necessarily, but many of them aren't coming to Mass. As a priest, I look at that as an opportunity to really take seriously my role as a spiritual guide to them. It's not just filling out the paperwork, name, date, phone number, baptism, that's great. But it's really an opportunity for us to minister to people. I haven't been a priest for all that long, but I have seen older priests who have these unique relationships with couples for whom they did weddings decades ago. And there's a connection that probably started because they were spending time together and they got personalized ministry in an important time in their life.
Well, Father Chris Cicero, thank you for spending time with us, and thank you for being with us. Have a good day, and God be with you.
Sacraments 101 was a production of CTNY, the Catholic Television Network of Youngstown. Your program host was Father Jim Corda.